There's something dangerously misunderstood about men, something most women are never taught to see. It's not about what they say or how they act on the surface. It's what they carry beneath, something hidden even from themselves. Carl Jung didn't speak of masculinity as a set of traits, but as a field of tension between the conscious and the unconscious. And in most men, that unconscious is dominated by a shadow they've never confronted. If you're a woman and you don't know how this shadow works, you will fall for the performance and suffer under the silence. You'll mistake control for strength, avoidance for maturity, and projection for love. Because when a man does not know himself, he will unconsciously ask you to carry the burden of his unintegrated soul, and it will break you if you let it. A man does not become dangerous to others because he's aggressive. He becomes dangerous when he's split, when his outer self says one thing, but his inner self speaks another. This happens when a man idolizes you early on, praises you for your beauty, your calm, your kindness, your presence, and then, weeks or months later, begins to grow distant, cold, or critical. You didn't change, but his image of you shattered. Jung called this the anima projection. Every man carries within him an unconscious feminine image, and when he meets a woman, he projects that image onto her. At first, it feels like love. It feels powerful, obsessive, mystical. But it's not you he's loving. It's his reflection in you. The qualities he's buried in himself. His vulnerability, his intuition, his emotional depth, his longing for wholeness. And when you stop reflecting those things in the way he unconsciously needs, his energy changes. Not because you failed him, but because the illusion is breaking. And most men are not ready for what comes after the illusion. When a man's anima projection collapses, one of two things happens. He either grows or he blames you. If he grows, he begins to see you clearly, as a real human, not a symbol. He begins to ask questions about himself, about his emotional history, his wounds, his patterns. He begins to integrate. But if he blames, he begins to withdraw, punish, detach, or dominate. You'll feel it in small ways first. The way he stops listening. The way he uses silence as power. The way he begins to correct your tone, your thoughts, your reactions. Not always with malice. Often with confusion. Because he doesn't know what he's doing. But the damage is the same. The woman becomes the mirror for his unlived self. And when that mirror stops reflecting what he wants, he begins to resent it. This is where so many women begin to doubt themselves. They remember the intensity, the closeness, the way he looked at them like they were the only thing that mattered. And they wonder, what did I do wrong? Why did he change? Was I not enough? But the truth is more complex. You weren't the one who changed. What changed was his ability to maintain the illusion. He wanted your softness to soothe him, your presence to ground him, your admiration to make him feel alive. And when you became real, when your needs, your limits, your shadows came forward, he could no longer maintain the fantasy. And instead of stepping into deeper intimacy, he stepped away. Not because he didn't care, but because he never learned how to love without projection. This is the wound in many men. They are taught to conquer, not connect, to achieve, not feel, to seek admiration, not inner awareness. So when they meet a woman who awakens their buried soul, they confuse that awakening with love. But it isn't love, it's revelation. And if they're not grounded enough to handle it, they will turn it against her. Jung saw this play out not only in personal relationships, but in myth, in dreams, in culture itself. The woman becomes the muse, the angel, the savior, and then, inevitably, the threat. And when that threat arises, the unconscious man either retreats or attacks. He sees your emotional depth not as beauty, but as chaos. Your independence not as power, but defiance. Your sadness not as truth, but inconvenience. And you are left wondering how the man who once adored you became the one who now barely looks at you. But this is not your fault. It is the echo of a deeper fracture. The man who cannot hold his own feminine cannot hold you. The man who cannot sit with his own pain cannot sit with yours. The man who fears his own weakness will always try to dominate yours. And until he does the inner work, no amount of devotion on your part can reach him. He does not need a perfect woman. He needs his own soul. And until he finds it, he will continue to lose you. So what does this mean for you? It means you must learn to see beyond the performance, beyond the romantic language, the charm, the admiration. You must learn to feel the difference between presence and projection, between love and possession, between intimacy and idealization. The man who truly sees you will not need you to be perfect. He will not disappear when you show your shadow. He will not collapse when you say no, because he is already whole, and he does not need you to complete him. He chooses to walk beside you, not in fantasy, but in truth. Most women don't realize how many men they've met who've never once seen them clearly. Not because these men are heartless or cruel, but because their perception is shaped through layers of unconscious filters. A man who has not faced himself will always see you as either an escape or a threat. There is rarely anything in between. And when a man lives from his shadow, every relationship becomes a stage for his internal war. You may think you're having a conversation about something simple, something emotional, something human. But to him, it becomes a challenge to his identity, his dominance, his control. And the moment he feels that grip weakening, the mask begins to slip. You'll know it by the shift. He once praised your strength. Now he calls it too much. He once loved your independence. Now he feels disrespected. He once said you were unlike anyone else. Now you're impossible to please. This isn't a change in you. It's a revelation of him. The man who needed you to reflect his ideal has encountered something he cannot integrate, your complexity. And his response to that complexity tells you everything. Not about his words, but about his depth. Carl Jung wrote extensively about what happens when a man represses the feminine elements of his psyche: emotion, intuition, receptivity. Over time, these disowned qualities become twisted, distorted, and they surface not as beauty, but as violence. Not always physical, often subtle, psychological, spiritual, the violence of indifference, of constant correction, of transactional intimacy, of emotional starvation. And as a woman, you begin to feel it before you can name it. You feel that your softness is being used. Your openness is being mined. Your empathy is being weaponized against you. But you keep giving, hoping that the man you first met will return. He won't, because he never truly arrived. What you met was the projection, the performance, the part of him that wanted to feel whole through you. But when wholeness requires him to face the very emotions he's buried, he retreats. And this retreat is rarely obvious. He doesn't scream. He doesn't slam doors. He just begins to look through you instead of at you. You become a function, a comfort, a set of tasks. And in your own home, in your own bed, you begin to vanish. Not because you are invisible, but because his ability to see has collapsed. This is what Jung meant by the shadow overtaking the conscious personality. The man may still speak as if everything's fine. He may still perform affection in public, but behind the scenes, his soul is gone. And you feel it. You always feel it. And that feeling of emotional isolation inside a relationship is one of the most devastating things a woman can experience. Is the quiet trauma no one talks about. The wound of being physically close to someone who is spiritually absent. And yet you stay. Not because you're weak, but because you remember the beginning, the warmth, the presence, the way he held you with his eyes. You believe that man is still somewhere inside him. And maybe he is. But until he faces the war inside himself, until he meets the parts of him he's exiled, especially his grief, his fear, his shame, you will never touch him again. You will only touch his armor. And the tragedy is you may begin to question your own reality, to wonder if you're asking for too much, to silence your intuition in exchange for proximity. Don't shrink yourself to maintain closeness with someone who disappeared the moment you stopped being convenient. Don't abandon your wholeness to keep a place in his fractured world, because love without integration is just dependency. It's not healing, it's repetition. It's your nervous system trying to resolve a wound through a mirror that keeps cracking. Jung warned that relationships will inevitably confront us with our own unconscious material, but only those willing to see it can grow. The rest just blame. And blaming women has always been one of the oldest tricks of the unconscious male shadow. He can't feel his own sadness, so he calls you dramatic. He can't process his fear, so he calls you unstable. He can't own his shame, so he mocks your boundaries. And you start to think it's love. You start to call it his way. But it's not his way. It's his wound. And unless he turns inward, you will keep carrying what was never yours to hold. This is the dark truth every woman must know. Not all men seek to harm, but most have never been taught how to feel. And what we cannot feel, we cannot hold. And what we cannot hold, we will try to control or destroy. So the next time a man grows cold, don't panic. Observe. The next time he distances, don't chase. Pause. The next time he criticizes your fullness, don't collapse. Listen, not to what he says, but to what his energy is showing you. The greatest act of love is not devotion to his potential. It's devotion to your own clarity. If he's willing to grow, you'll feel it. His energy will soften. His language will change. His presence will deepen. But if he isn't, if all he knows is how to perform, how to project, how to punish, then your work is not to teach him. Your work is to stop betraying your own knowing. Because you always know, there is a silence many women fall into. It's not the silence of peace. It's the silence of confusion. A silence that arrives slowly after months or years of being looked at, but never really seen, of being held, but never truly met, of being desired, but only when it feels safe for him. And one day you realize you were never in a relationship with a whole man. You were in a relationship with a man at war with himself. Most men are not afraid of women. They are afraid of what women awaken in them. Not just desire, but vulnerability, chaos, emotion, feeling. And feeling is the one thing most men were trained to suppress. So when they fall in love, or believe they're falling in love, they're not prepared for what comes next, the unraveling. Because love is not clean. It breaks control. It shatters distance. It invites them into parts of themselves they've never touched. And that's when fear sets in. He wants you, but only on terms that keep his ego safe. He wants your softness, but not your questions. Your presence, but not your pain. Your beauty, but not your truth. He says he wants closeness, but flinches when it arrives. Because real closeness demands something he doesn't yet know how to give: surrender. Not of his strength, but of his masks. And without those masks, he doesn't know who he is. And if he doesn't know who he is, he cannot know how to hold you. Jung understood this tension well. He saw how the masculine psyche, when undeveloped, clings to control, and how the feminine energy, whether in the man's inner world or in a real woman before him, becomes a perceived threat to that control. The more free you are, the more unstable he feels. The more expressive you are, the more unsafe he becomes. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your freedom exposes his cage. That is the paradox most women find themselves in. He is drawn to your fire, but once he gets close, he tries to put it out. He says it's too much, too intense, too sensitive, too unpredictable. But what he really means is this: I don't know how to stay whole while loving something I can't dominate. So he pulls back, or tries to shrink you, or retreats into work, detachment, rationality, anything that keeps him from feeling what your presence reveals. And if you've been conditioned to equate love with sacrifice, you'll respond by making yourself smaller. You'll take on the weight of his discomfort. You'll hold back your truth, suppress your needs, adjust your voice, doubt your intuition. Not because you want to, but because you hope that if you just become easier, he'll come closer again. But closeness built on your silence is not closeness. It's self-erasure. And slowly, you disappear. Here's what most women don't realize until it's too late. The man who cannot sit with your fullness has never sat with his own. And if he has never faced his own fear, he will try to manage yours. Not soothe it, control it, dismiss it, belittle it, shut down. Not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't know how to feel safe in the presence of the unknown. And the feminine, in its rawest form, is the unknown. This is where projection becomes dangerous. He begins to frame your emotions as instability, your intuition as irrationality, your insight as attack. He turns your emotional world into a battlefield, not because it is won, but because he cannot hold his own inner conflict. Jung called this the inflation of the ego, when a man believes he is grounded while floating above everything real. And when he's confronted with anything he cannot control, he either devalues it or distances from it. You will notice this not in his words, but in his absence. He becomes unavailable when you need depth. He turns cold when you express vulnerability. He intellectualizes your sadness. He offers solutions when you need presence. He grows uncomfortable when you ask for more than he feels ready to give. But it's not about the request. It's about what that request touches in him. A wound, a memory, a softness he buried long ago. And because he refuses to meet that part of himself, he cannot meet you. And yet, you try harder. You communicate more. You explain in clearer terms. You study relationship dynamics, trauma, communication theory. You bring your best self forward again and again, hoping that one day he will rise to meet you. But he never will, until he faces his fear of your freedom, until he understands that your independence is not a threat to him, but an invitation to step into himself fully. This is the unseen battle in many relationships. The woman asks for connection. The man hears criticism. The woman expresses emotion. The man hears instability. The woman stands in her power. The man hears challenge. And in every one of those moments, he has a choice to expand or to defend. And far too many choose defense, because expansion means confronting everything they were told to bury. You cannot fix that. You cannot teach him to feel. You cannot make him ready. Your only responsibility is to remain intact, to stop twisting yourself into shapes that keep him comfortable, to stop calling emotional distance maturity, to stop accepting half connection as enough. The man who is ready will not ask you to shrink. He will not punish your depth. He will not treat your soul as a threat. He will meet you. And if he can't, that is not your failure. It's his delay. There comes a moment in many relationships where you can feel it. He stops trying to understand you and starts trying to manage you. Not overtly, not with loud control, but with subtle shifts. You notice that every time you bring something up, the conversation turns into a maze. Not a dialogue, but a trap. You try to express how you feel, and he answers with logic, not presence. You show your pain, and he gives you critique, not care. You speak from your heart, and he responds from his defense. And slowly, you begin to question your own reality. This is not love. This is emotional warfare wrapped in civility. And most of the time, he doesn't even know he's doing it. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because his tactics aren't planned. They're unconscious, reflexive. They're his shadow acting through him. The wounded parts that refuse to be seen, now projecting themselves onto you. And when you become the carrier of what he doesn't want to feel, the relationship becomes an invisible prison, a space where you're allowed to exist, but only if you don't disturb his sense of control. Carl Jung wrote about this dynamic extensively. He saw how the unconscious parts of the psyche, when unintegrated, do not disappear. They seek expression in relationships. The man who cannot face his own fear of failure will make you feel like you're never satisfied. The man who represses his shame will project it onto your emotions. The man who cannot grieve his childhood will mock you for being too emotional. He doesn't see you. He sees what he has rejected in himself and calls it your flaw. And because you love him, you try to help. You lower your tone. You soften your words. You apologize when you shouldn't. You try not to bring up too much at once. You walk on eggshells while calling it patience. But what you're really doing is managing his shadow for him. You're trying to carry a weight that does not belong to you. And the more you carry it, the more disconnected you become from yourself. This is how slow emotional erosion begins. You start to feel responsible for his moods, for his silence, for the fact that he no longer looks at you the same. And in that confusion, guilt takes root. You wonder if maybe you are too sensitive. Maybe you are too critical. Maybe you're the problem. But you're not. You're just responding to an environment that subtly punishes you for being real. The punishment doesn't always look harsh. Sometimes it comes as withdrawal. Sometimes as irritation. Sometimes as cool politeness that leaves you starving for warmth. Sometimes it comes as praise for the version of you that keeps the peace and punishment for the version that doesn't. And slowly, your nervous system begins to adapt. You start editing your truth before you even speak. You start rehearsing your tone, your words, your timing. Not because you're irrational, but because you've learned that your truth creates conflict. And conflict makes you feel unsafe in love. But the truth is, the conflict was never created by your expression. It was created by his inability to sit with what your expression reveals. Jung knew that anything we repress in ourselves becomes a force that seeks power over others. The man who represses vulnerability will always try to dominate yours. Not with aggression, but with interpretation. He'll turn your tears into manipulation, your needs into drama, your boundaries into rejection. He may never yell. He may never insult you directly, but you will feel smaller every time you try to stand fully in yourself. And here's the hardest part. The more you love him, the longer you will stay. Not because you're blind, but because you are loyal. Because you see the good in him. Because you remember the tenderness. Because you believe, deep down, that he is still capable of meeting you. And maybe he is. But love does not grow in spaces where only one person is doing the emotional labor. You cannot keep healing yourself just to survive a connection that keeps reopening the wound. Real love is not a performance. It's not about managing perception. It's not about staying small so someone else can feel big. It's not about sacrificing your reality for his comfort. It's about standing in your full emotional presence and being met there, not tolerated, not silenced, but met. And the man who is not ready for that will make you pay for your wholeness. He will turn it into a burden. He will make your clarity feel like pressure and your radiance feel like chaos. Not because you're too much, but because he's still hiding from the part of himself that longs to feel and doesn't know how. This is what Jung meant when he said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. A man who has not accepted himself will always ask you to shrink, so he doesn't have to grow. And if you keep shrinking, you will not only lose the relationship, you will lose yourself. But you can stop. You can pause. You can listen to that quiet voice inside you that says, "This doesn't feel like love anymore." You can name what you've been carrying. You can get it back. And you can remember that your emotional depth is not a flaw. It's a filter. It's what protects you from the performance. It's what reveals who is real and who is not. There's a quiet moment after the confusion, after the guilt, after all the attempts to make it work. It doesn't come with a scream or an argument. It arrives slowly, like a breath that no longer asks for permission. It's the moment you stop trying to be understood by someone who has no intention of understanding you. The moment you realize that clarity is more important than closeness, that your peace is worth more than his potential. That love, without truth, is just captivity dressed up as devotion. This is the beginning of your return to yourself. Not in rebellion, not in punishment, but in truth. Because for too long, you've been living in response to him, watching his mood before speaking, shrinking your joy so it doesn't overwhelm him, suppressing your sadness so it doesn't disturb him. You learn to live around his discomfort, around his fragility, around his silence. And in doing so, you began to forget the shape of your own soul. Jung taught that every time we betray ourselves for the sake of another, we strengthen the shadow, not just in them, but in ourselves. The moment you start to compromise your truth for someone else's comfort, you're no longer in relationship. You are in emotional survival. You become the reflection, the echo, the symbol, not the woman. And the tragedy is, he may not even notice. Because a man who sees you as a projection will never recognize when you've gone silent. He will only notice when you stop reflecting him altogether. And by then, it's too late. Because you're no longer willing to disappear to be loved. You begin to feel the old pattern losing power. The need to explain yourself fades. The urge to fix him dissolves. The ache to be seen by him no longer holds the same weight. And that doesn't mean the love was false. It means it was incomplete, because you were never met in your entirety. You were met in the version of you that didn't threaten his unhealed story. The version that held back just enough to keep things smooth. Just enough to be admired but not challenged. Desired but not fully witnessed. Now, something else rises. Not rage, not revenge, but presence. A presence that no longer needs to justify itself. That no longer accepts being praised only when silent. That no longer folds in on itself to avoid confrontation. That no longer tries to translate its truth into a language his ego will approve of. You start to speak without performing. You start to feel without apologizing. You start to say no without guilt. You start to trust the intelligence of your own discomfort. Because now you know, when love costs your voice, it is no longer love. It is a transaction, a script, and you're not here to be a supporting role in someone else's unresolved myth. The woman who returns to herself is not cold. She is not cruel. She is simply done abandoning her own clarity for the sake of keeping something that only ever existed under conditions. She is done holding space for a man who refuses to hold his own reflection. She is done teaching what should already be known, that connection without emotional presence is not safety, it's self-neglect. And maybe he will notice. Maybe, for the first time, he will feel the emptiness he tried to fill through her. Maybe he will realize that his attempts to control what he feared ended up destroying what he needed. Maybe he will see the cost of his silence, the truth behind her distance, the weight of everything she never said, because she already knew it would be dismissed. Or maybe he won't. Maybe he'll tell himself that she changed, that she became cold, that she expected too much. But deep down, something in him will know that her departure was the result of everything he refused to face. This is where the true separation happens. Not when bodies leave each other, but when a woman stops waiting to be met. She no longer hopes for a breakthrough. She no longer mistakes longing for depth. She no longer confuses emotional hunger with love. And from that place, she doesn't become bitter. She becomes sovereign. Jung would say this is individuation, the process of becoming whole. Not through isolation, but through integration. You're no longer fragmented, no longer defined by someone else's capacity. You no longer identify yourself through someone else's projections. You stand in yourself, in the grief, in the silence, in the fire. And from that place, your energy changes. You're no longer reaching out. You're drawing in, not from need, from resonance. The right people feel it, not just lovers, but friends, spaces, life itself. You no longer attract connection from your wound. You attract it from your center. And that center, after everything, is finally intact. Not perfect, not painless, but whole. So you stop asking why he changed. You stop needing closure. You stop rereading the old messages. You stop performing the conversation in your head. You stop pretending that if you had said it differently, he would have stayed. You stop blaming yourself for not being easier to swallow. And you start remembering that you were never too much. You were just too real for someone who had only ever known performance. You were never the problem. You were the mirror. And when he looked into you, he saw everything he wasn't ready to become. So he looked away. But you won't. You won't look away from yourself again. There is a kind of freedom that comes, not from winning, not from being chosen, not even from being understood, but from no longer needing any of it to feel whole. That freedom is quiet. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't come with revenge. It doesn't even come with answers. It comes when you stop orbiting around someone who is never grounded in themselves. It comes when your center is no longer determined by someone else's capacity to see you. That's what happens when you finally stop waiting for a man to grow into the space he pretended to hold. You no longer shape your light to be less blinding. You no longer edit your softness to make it easier to receive. You no longer split yourself into the woman he adored and the one he couldn't handle. Because now you understand, he wasn't loving you. He was loving the part of himself he saw in you. And when that part no longer felt safe, he didn't deepen. He withdrew, not because you changed, but because you stopped serving the illusion. Carl Jung once wrote that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. Many men resist their inner feminine, their capacity for tenderness, intuition, emotional truth. And so that resistance becomes projection. It grows until the only way they can experience those qualities is through women, but not by meeting them, by trying to possess them, control them, silence them. And the woman, not knowing what is happening, thinks something's wrong with her, when in truth, she was never the problem. She was the invitation. You were the invitation to depth, to presence, to emotional honesty. And if he declined, it's not because you weren't enough, it's because he wasn't ready. And now you are. You are ready to stop calling emotional starvation strength. You are ready to stop measuring your worth by how long you can hold space for someone who disappears when you step into your truth. You are ready to stop loving the potential of a man more than the reality of yourself. You don't need to hate him to move on. You don't need to destroy the past. You don't even need to regret it. You can see him clearly now, not as a villain, not as a savior, but as a mirror, a reflection of your own growth, a necessary part of your evolution. He showed you where you were still seeking validation, where you still longed to be chosen, where you still confused attention with intimacy, where you still made your softness something to be earned instead of owned. And now, you choose yourself differently. Not in defiance, not in pride, but in peace. You no longer need to prove that you're lovable. You no longer need to be easy to digest. You no longer crave the fantasy of being seen by someone who hasn't seen himself. You're no longer willing to water down your wisdom to avoid intimidating someone who doesn't know how to feel. You stop apologizing for your fire. You stop apologizing for your silence. You stop apologizing for not being a mirror for a man's buried wounds. You don't need to explain anything. Your energy says enough now. You no longer chase clarity from someone who lives in contradiction. You no longer look for warmth where there's only strategy. You no longer try to resurrect connection where there's only resistance. You let go, not because you gave up, but because you woke up. And in that awakening, you found something deeper than desire. You found your own presence, your own stillness, your own emotional authority. And from this place, something sacred happens. You stop attracting love from your unhealed places. You start attracting it from your fullness. You stop repeating cycles. You stop confusing chemistry with alignment. You begin to feel who is real, not by what they say, but by how your body responds in their presence. You begin to notice the ones who aren't overwhelmed by your depth, who don't turn your boundaries into burdens, who don't need to dominate your tenderness to feel strong. You begin to choose differently, because now you're not choosing from a wound. You're choosing for your center. This is what Jung meant by inner integration. When the unconscious becomes conscious, when you stop repeating ancestral dynamics, when you stop playing the role of savior or symbol, when you're no longer fragmented, but whole. You didn't lose anything when he couldn't meet you. You returned to your voice, to your instincts, to your truth. You now understand what most don't, that not every love story is meant to be completed. Some are meant to wake you up. Some are meant to show you where you still abandon yourself. Some are meant to burn away the illusions so that you can finally see clearly. And when the smoke clears, there you are, not broken, not bitter, not closed, but wiser, quieter, fiercer in your compassion, and more loyal to your own soul than ever before. So don't chase his closure. Don't carry his shame. Don't try to become palatable for someone who never sat at the table of his own emotions. You were never too much. You were the reminder of everything he's still afraid to feel. And now, that's no longer yours to carry. You've returned home.